What if I told you your ancestors survived on rotten meat, bitter roots, insects wriggling in their hands, and called it dinner? Forget romantic tales of mighty hunters feasting on mammoths. The real Stone Age diet was a brutal gamble for every scrap of life. By the end of this video, you might wonder not how they lived like that, but how you ever could. Stick around because the raw truth of what kept them alive is far stranger and darker than you've ever imagined. There's something oddly magnetic about the image of prehistoric life that keeps pulling modern people back in time. Maybe it's the yearning for simplicity, a quiet rebellion against the fluorescent chaos of grocery stores packed with brightly labeled boxes and chemical-laced treats. Or perhaps it's the deep, almost primal instinct that whispers to us that the further back we look, the closer we get to what humans were truly meant to be. That instinct has fueled countless glossy books, breathless documentaries, and flashy online influencers who promise a return to the purity of our ancestors' plates. They show sculpted bodies gnawing on sizzling steaks by firelight, touting the power of going primal, and assure anyone listening that all it takes to reclaim your vitality is to eat like the cavemen did. The phenomenon is everywhere. Food companies slap the word paleo on everything from granola to beef jerky, as if the mere hint of caveman approval will transform us. Influencers slice into rare slabs of meat, eyes rolling back with theatrical ecstasy, promising their followers that this is the secret humans have always known. We're told that if we just avoid processed sugar, refined flour, and those cursed industrial oils, we'll unlock some hidden switch in our DNA that launches us into peak performance. It's a compelling fantasy that by mimicking the supposed diet of the Paleolithic era, we can become leaner, sharper, more vigorous, even somehow more authentic. But this dream of a simpler, wilder way to nourish ourselves is built on a strangely selective memory. We like to imagine rugged hunters triumphantly dragging home fresh carcasses, families feasting by torchlight, children giggling as they lick marrow from their tiny hands. There's hardly a thought spared for the long stretches when there was nothing at all. Modern interpretations are tinted with romance and a certain smugness, as if we've rediscovered a lost manual for optimal living and can now fix all the ailments civilization has thrust upon us. Yet behind this carefully curated narrative lies a darker, far messier truth that doesn't fit quite so neatly on a wellness brand's Instagram grid. For starters, this notion that our Paleolithic ancestors were perpetually brimming with health is more marketing myth than biological fact. The actual lives of those who trudged through forests and stalked icy tundras were teetering constantly on the edge of depletion. Bones unearthed from prehistoric sites tell a silent story of fragile frames, worn joints, broken teeth, and short, brutal spans of existence punctuated by fever and frailty. While modern enthusiasts claim that cutting out modern staples is the key to longevity, the reality is that our ancestors were often driven by little more than desperation and luck. It's also oddly convenient how we cherry-pick from the Stone Age menu. People gushing about raw liver smoothies and pasture-fed steaks rarely line up to snack on grasshoppers or dig grubs out from under rotting logs, yet that was just as much a part of the prehistoric table. We skip over the nauseating bits, preferring to stylize the caveman diet into a rugged, masculine ritual centered on perfect cuts of meat. And there's a certain hubris in believing we can replicate the complexities of a forager's ecology by simply tossing out bread and buying some organic ribeyes. Underneath all this, there's a genuine danger that lurks in modern attempts to recreate the past. When people cling to the idea of some nutritional Eden that existed before agriculture, they often ignore the brutal balancing act that allowed early humans to survive at all. The bodies that roamed those ancient plains were constantly at war with scarcity. Their guts were forged in hardship, their tastes molded by urgency, their health hanging on the thread of whether a migration path would deliver enough wild tubers or if the caribou would return in time. We, by contrast, are fragile in ways they could not afford to be. Our immune systems, our stomach acids, even our risk tolerance are far removed from the raw resilience encoded into those first wanderers. And so our fascination grows. It's easier to imagine that the secret lies in a steak, that we can buy our way to primordial vitality with the right cookbook or meal delivery service. It's harder to face the humbling possibility that the past was less about robust health and more about enduring another day, hoping the next bite, whatever it was, would keep the family moving forward. The truth is less picturesque, but infinitely more human. It was never about chasing six-pack abs or sharpening the mind with artisan bacon. It was about not collapsing in the dust before the sunset. This longing we feel, the ache for some lost authenticity, says more about our modern anxieties than it does about prehistoric triumphs. The Stone Age diet was born of necessity, not choice. And as we start peeling back the illusions, pushing past the sizzling steaks and polished slogans, we find ourselves confronting a reality far more complicated and, in many ways, far more haunting. Because the deeper we look, the clearer it becomes that surviving, as our ancestors did, was not a testament to perfect design, but a fragile, desperate dance with nature. And it leads us to wonder, with a faint shiver, if we were suddenly dropped into their world, could we even make it past the first hungry week? We don't just crave a return to the primitive, we glamorize it. From glossy films that cast broad-shouldered hunters racing across golden meadows to viral blogs gushing over ancestral living, the image of the prehistoric human is carved in bold, heroic strokes. We see chiseled muscles glistening with sweat, laughter around roaring fires, bodies fueled by nothing but pure meat, wild berries, and an untamed zest for life. Even modern video games and survival shows peddle this fantasy, portraying early humans as unstoppable warriors with stomachs of iron and instincts sharper than obsidian blades. Somewhere along the way, we convinced ourselves that these people were not just surviving, but thriving, that they were eternally well-fed, perpetually powerful, and never burdened by the slow erosions of disease or hunger. Influencers love to echo this sentiment, sprinkling references to hunter-gatherer genes and proudly insisting that if we just reclaim our heritage, we'll unlock some dormant feral excellence sleeping inside us. There's a seductive poetry to it. The idea that if we strip away our processed comforts, we'll stand taller, see clearer, feel more alive. But this vision crumbles quickly under the weight of archaeology. The bones that remain from those long-lost souls do not sing songs of boundless vigor. They are scarred and pitted, often twisted by infection or worn down to fragile nubs. Skulls with cracked jaws and shattered teeth whisper of lives spent grinding tough roots and chewing fibrous plants until gums bled. Long bones etched with stress markers tell of bodies pushed past their limits, not in pursuit of sculpted physiques, but out of sheer necessity to chase or flee, forage or carry, day after relentless day. We rarely see that side of prehistory because it doesn't fit the clean, aspirational narrative. Imagine trying to sell a diet plan accompanied by illustrations of gaunt faces, bloated bellies from chronic undernutrition, or ribs so stark under thin skin that each breath seemed to threaten a break. There's little market value in that sort of honesty. So instead, we craft tales that erase the constant edge of hunger, swap frailty for flawless strength, and gloss over the terror of coming up empty after hours of tracking a herd that simply wasn't there. Modern retellings cherry-pick moments that feel cinematic. The victorious hunt, the crack of a spear finding its mark, the triumphant hoisting of fresh kill onto broad shoulders. They skip past the days when the only thing caught was a handful of insects or a single scrawny lizard. They ignore the way entire family groups might wander for days, nibbling bitter leaves, bellies gnawing themselves from the inside out. And they certainly leave out the desperation that sometimes drove people to scavenge meat already slick with rot or scrape marrow from old bones left behind by larger predators. Our illusions aren't just built by Hollywood or Instagram. They're reinforced by how we wish to see ourselves. Unbreakable, aligned with some noble past, possessed of an ancient clarity that modern life has supposedly stripped away. It's comforting to believe that we can forge a connection to powerful ancestors by simply mirroring what we think they ate. Yet this belief leans on fragile fantasy. The actual prehistoric diet was chaotic, dictated by what could be found on any given day. Some seasons brought flushes of fruit or migratory herds, short-lived banquets. Far more common were long stretches defined by scarcity, by scraping by on tubers that burned the throat, or greens that offered more fiber than real nourishment. The gulf between what we imagine and what truly was is vast and shadowed. The prehistoric table was not laid out with tender steaks and heaping bowls of berries under a star-kissed sky. It was scattered with whatever could be coaxed from a stingy landscape. Most of the time, that meant eating things we would wrinkle our noses at now, forcing down flavors that clashed and textures that repelled, all for the sake of staying upright for another day. And yet, even as we begin to peel back these myths, there's a strange awe that grows. Because despite the grime and the desperation, these ancestors managed to persist. They found ways to glean life from a harsh earth, to keep fires burning and children fed against staggering odds. The true marvel isn't that they lived perfectly, but that they lived at all. And this realization beckons us to dig deeper, past our comfortable caricatures, to see what a prehistoric menu really looked like when the world turned cold and cruel, and hunger pressed in from every side. Hunger was not a stranger that arrived once every few weeks to tap at the shoulder of prehistoric people. It was a constant companion, a whisper in the belly that grew louder with each passing hour, only briefly silenced by the rare satisfaction of a substantial find. Unlike today, where most discomfort is quickly eased by the opening of a refrigerator or a short stroll to the market, for early humans, feeling hungry was simply how life felt. It threaded itself through their thoughts, their sleep, their waking moments. It was as ordinary as the breath in their lungs. Imagine waking each morning on the cold ground or under a canopy of leaves, joints stiff, mouth dry, stomach already beginning its low, twisting plea. Before your eyes even fully opened, your mind would have sparked with calculations. Where could food be found today? Was there a stream that might yield a few small fish? Were there roots left to dig in the hard soil nearby, or had they all been stripped bare by your own clan weeks ago? Could the insects that lived under the bark of a certain tree be plentiful enough to sustain a day's energy? There was no baseline of fullness against which hunger stood out as an anomaly. Being truly satisfied was rare enough to be almost mythic, a fleeting state that never lingered long enough to reshape bodies into the robust images we often paint of these early people. Instead, they lived perched on the edge of depletion, Muscles lean not from sculpted fitness regimens, but because their bodies simply did not accumulate excess. Every calorie that entered was precious fuel that had to be spent wisely, eked out in careful movements, because the next opportunity might be days away. This persistent undercurrent of want sculpted them in profound ways. It made them alert to every rustle in the brush, every distant call of birds that might signal carrion. It made them willing to taste things we would recoil from. Fibrous stems that made the tongue numb, leaves so bitter they left tears in the eyes, beetles that cracked unpleasantly between the teeth. The desperation to stave off the gnawing emptiness pressed them into trying and trying again, with a trial and error method that sometimes led to poisoning, but just as often added another meager option to their grim menu. Even their social bonds were, in many respects, woven by hunger. Sharing a find, no matter how small, could cement alliances that might one day save a life. Failing to share could provoke simmering resentments that boiled over at exactly the wrong moment. A freshly killed hare was not simply dinner, it was a political event, a bargaining chip, a reason for others to watch you with interest or envy. The aroma of meat roasting on open flame would draw children with wide eyes and adults who tried to appear casual, though their hearts sped up with the thought of even a morsel. Because the reality was that their bodies were almost always in a mild state of starvation. Modern research into the growth patterns seen in fossilized bones reveals the pauses in development. Lines like tree rings that whisper of long stretches when nourishment simply wasn't enough to allow proper growth. Teeth formed with ridges and pits where minerals were lacking during critical phases of childhood. Their very skeletons remember the chronic absence of plenty, long after flesh turned to dust. It's tempting to imagine that such constant hunger would produce only misery, but it also forged an astonishing resilience and cunning. They learned to read the landscape with an expertise we can barely fathom, noticing subtle signs in disturbed soil, the flicker of insect swarms that might reveal hidden carcasses, or the coloration of leaves that hinted at the presence of edible tubers underground. Their minds, sharpened by the necessity to seek and secure food, could retain astonishing detail about where a certain tree had fruited seasons before, or where animal tracks repeatedly cut through a hidden glen. Still, this did not spare them from the psychological weight of continual deprivation. The quiet fear of watching children grow listless, or elders who began to retreat into themselves because the energy to keep up with the band simply wasn't there. Hunger was not just a physical sensation, but a communal shadow. It shaped rituals and superstitions, gave rise to stories that explained why one valley was barren and another lush. They looked for patterns, desperate to predict when fortune might smile again, and when it might just as easily turn away, leaving their bellies hollow. And so every morning they stood up from hard ground and resumed the same anxious dance, seeking, sampling, watching each other for clues of who might have found something hidden. A good day might end with the rare delight of real meat or a bounty of insects roasted on coals. A bad day ended with stomachs still curling in on themselves, sleep haunted by dreams of abundance that always evaporated with the dawn. This was the texture of daily life, not of mighty conquerors of the wilderness, but of fragile beings endlessly improvising to keep the relentless hand of hunger from closing around their throats. Archaeologists piecing together ancient kill sites have uncovered telling evidence of how rare these victories truly were. Pits and traps show signs of repeated reuse, sometimes layered with years of attempts that only occasionally ended in success. Tools left abandoned in hurry speak of sudden failures, a spooked herd that bolted before the fatal moment, leaving painstaking strategies to collapse in dust. Even when kills were made, they were sporadic, often separated by long intervals that pressed families back into reliance on the more humble, steady gleaning of plants, insects, and whatever small creatures they could catch. There's also the quiet truth written into the bodies of the hunters themselves. Skeletons show stress fractures and joint degeneration consistent with relentless, often fruitless pursuits across rough terrain. Their frames weren't swollen with the robust protein-driven bulk we might imagine. Instead, they bore the lean, wiry signatures of people who burned far more than they ever reliably consumed. Stories passed down in oral traditions long after the Stone Age ended still echo the uncertainty of the hunt. Even in societies far removed from mammoths and saber-toothed predators, the reverence and fear surrounding large game persists. Ceremonies to appease spirits, dances to invite good fortune, charms meant to bend the will of the animals. All of these reflect an ancestral understanding that to step out with hopes of meat was to flirt with deep, life-altering risk. Because every time hunters left the relative safety of their camp, they faced a simple, brutal equation. They might bring back meat that would revive everyone's strength for days, even weeks. Or they might bring back nothing, leaving their kin to lie awake another night, stomachs coiling on themselves, dreams haunted by phantom feasts. The towering fires we love to picture, the endless feasts of tender mammoth flesh, they happened, yes, but as rare, miraculous punctuation marks in lives otherwise defined by absence. And so, as the embers of another day cooled into darkness, families would cluster together, wrapping thin skins tighter, hoping that tomorrow the trail would be clearer, the animals slower, fortune finally kinder. Yet always bracing for the far more likely possibility that tomorrow would simply be another long walk back, with hands empty, eyes scanning the horizon, not in triumph, but in quiet, gnawing resignation. There's a particularly stubborn legend that clings to our collective imagination, that every evening in the Paleolithic was lit by cowering flames around which families gathered, sinking their teeth into steaming slabs of fresh meat carved straight from the colossal flank of a mammoth or some equally majestic beast. This idea has been painted in countless stories, movies, and even marketing campaigns, reinforcing the image of prehistoric people as tireless hunters who simply stepped into the wilderness, hurled a spear, and returned victorious. A steady parade of triumphs, night after night, as if the world then was one endless open-air banquet hall. But reality, stripped of our eager fantasies, was far crueler and infinitely more uncertain. In truth, hunting was never a guarantee of meat. It was an exhausting gamble, often stacked against success by forces no spear or cunning could overcome. Most of the time, it ended with nothing more than aching legs, empty hands, and bellies that clenched tighter in disappointment. For one, the sheer scale of what these hunters attempted is staggering to consider. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, even herds of bison. These were animals of immense power, with hides thicker than any casual throw of a sharpened stick could penetrate. Bringing down such a creature required not just brute strength, but weeks or even months of careful tracking, reading signs left in mud or snow, learning migration patterns that might change with a sudden shift in the wind. And even if the band's patience held, and they managed to corner a lumbering giant, it took coordinated attacks, enormous risk, and often many failed tries before a single kill was made. More commonly, those who set out with hopes of meat returned with nothing but stories of where the herd had moved, or how sudden weather had erased their tracks, or how the beasts simply kept moving beyond reach, as if guided by some instinct to stay just far enough away from hungry hands. Days might pass in pursuit, each footstep burning precious energy stores that could ill afford to be wasted, before hunters trudged back to camp empty-handed. That emptiness wasn't just a private disappointment. It sent ripples of unease through the entire group. A failed hunt meant another night of scraping together roots and tubers, stretching out tiny caches of dried insects, or gnawing once again on fibrous greens that filled the belly but did little to truly nourish. It meant mothers watching their children with growing worry, elders huddling closer to conserve failing strength. It meant that the next morning would begin with even more urgency, desperation twisting itself tighter around every decision. The earth they wandered across was never steady beneath their feet. Seasons shifted with merciless indifference, reshaping everything they depended on, as if the very ground conspired to keep them perpetually uncertain. When you lived hand to mouth in a world governed by instinct and chance, you learned quickly how small you truly were under the vast, ever-changing sky. Herds that once painted the horizon with life could vanish almost overnight, driven away by distant storms, droughts, or the slow churn of ice creeping down from the north. In those moments, entire families would wake to silence where once there had been the low, comforting rumble of hoofbeats. The air, once alive with the sense of animals and promise, turned thin and sharp. Hunters set out on the same familiar trails only to find trampled grass growing wild again, the prints of heavy feet lost to time and wind. Each failed day out searching for signs carved another notch of fear into their hearts, because they knew that without the herds, the forest's undergrowth and the meager stores of dried plants would not carry them through the coming cold. It wasn't just that they relied on these animals for the occasional feast of meat. Their very survival strategy wrapped itself around the predictable returns of migrations, the delicate timing of calving seasons, the bursts of new life that briefly swelled the ranks of prey. A small mistake in reading the patterns, a delay in packing up camp and following the herds, or misjudging when rivers would freeze and cut off access, could mean arriving too late to a hunting ground already stripped bare. Even the plants they foraged bowed to the dictates of climate. A sudden late frost could blacken shoots they depended on for early spring nourishment. Rains that failed to come left berries shriveled on their stems, roots locked tight in unyielding dirt. And so people watched the skies with an intimacy most of us today will never comprehend, scanning the tilt of clouds, the erratic paths of birds, the smell of damp or dust carried on uncertain breezes. Each subtle hint might be the difference between enough to eat and weeks of gnawing emptiness. When climate truly turned, stretching beyond the petty extremes of one season into years of hardship, it was rarely a single family that suffered. Whole bands broke apart, splintered by hunger and the simmering conflicts that flared when resources thinned. Mothers might clutch their children tighter, eyes darting not just to the horizon for hope of returning game, but also sideways at their neighbors, wondering how long solidarity would hold when the scraps ran out. Sometimes, as stories passed down hinted, people simply vanished. Camps abandoned, hearths cold, tools left scattered as if dropped in mid-thought. Archaeologists who uncovered such sites centuries later found eerie scenes. Fire pits filled with charcoal, stone blades still sharp, but no trace of where the families went, as though the land itself had opened and swallowed them. In truth, they likely moved on in desperate waves, chasing rumors of greener places, only to be swallowed by terrain too barren to sustain them, or by silent catastrophes of cold and thirst. Through it all, climate remained an impassive ruler. It didn't rage in storms alone. It spoke in the slow drift of glaciers grinding forests to powder, in rivers shifting course to leave dry beds where fish once teemed, in new pests and blights that crawled across the land. Each subtle change was felt keenly by bodies already dancing on the edge of depletion. A few degrees cooler, a few weeks' delay in migration, and a cycle of life finely balanced by generations would collapse, taking dreams, children, entire bloodlines with it. Yet they adapted because they had to. When one valley failed them, they shouldered what little they had and pressed onward, feet blistered, shoulders bent under makeshift burdens. They traded familiar trails for unknown risks, hoping to stumble upon a pocket of the world still generous enough to sustain their fragile hopes. In this way, climate and the fates of distant herds didn't just dictate what ended up in their bellies. They decided who lived long enough to watch another sunrise, who carried stories forward, and whose names were swallowed forever by the wind. When the hunts failed and the great herds slipped away beyond reach, when the skies dried up or froze solid and left the rivers choked with silence, that was when their real menu emerged in full, unflinching detail. In those raw stretches of winter or punishing drought, the polite illusions fell away, revealing exactly how far the human stomach was willing to stretch just to keep drawing breath. They scraped meals out of places most modern eyes would never think to look. Hands, calloused and cracked from cold or dust, dug into brittle earth to pry out stubborn roots that twisted like old veins beneath the soil. These were not sweet, tender morsels waiting to be plucked. Most were bitter enough to pull tears to the eyes, or left a burning in the throat that lingered long after swallowing. Some had to be chewed for ages to soften their fibrous bodies, each bite a contest of will against taste and texture. Rocks were overturned not to find treasure, but to chase what skittered underneath. Fat, squirming beetle larvae were plucked from cool darkness and pinched between teeth that had long ago learned not to hesitate. Certain times of year brought out swarms of insects that darkened the air, and quick hands could capture enough to fill small woven pouches. Roasted over embers, they crackled and shrank, releasing a sharp, nutty scent that did its best to masquerade as something richer than it was. Bark was not always just fuel for the fire. Thin layers were sometimes peeled away, inner strips scraped off and chewed to extract whatever fragile hint of nourishment lay locked inside. Moss, too, found its place on their tongues. In damp forests, they could pick through patches to find tender shoots hidden within, or squeeze them out for drops of moisture when no clean streams remained. Bones left over from kills long past became precious all over again. They were cracked open with stones to get at the marrow inside, which even in tiny amounts offered dense, life-saving energy. Some bones were so old they had already started to grow brittle, but still they were smashed, sucked, and licked clean of any lingering traces of fat. Fire pits sometimes turned into makeshift kitchens where old bones were boiled for hours, the thin broth sipped in greedy gulps that tried to convince empty bellies that something substantial had been found. During these harsh stretches, what they consumed said less about tradition and far more about sheer necessity. The palette of flavors was not pleasant. It was the sour tang of half-rotted greens discovered beneath melting snow, the acrid bitterness of wild seeds ground into coarse paste that stuck to the teeth, the faintly gamey taste of insects that resisted even the cleansing heat of flame. These were times when every member of a band learned the silent agreement to eat what was offered without complaint, because complaint did nothing to change the hard fact that it was this or nothing at all. It's easy to imagine that once humans discovered how to use fire, things improved. But in reality, cooking simply became another desperate tool to make otherwise inedible things a little less punishing. Many roots and tubers contained mild toxins that fire helped neutralize. Certain tough greens softened enough to be swallowed only after long simmering. Meals stretched not to satisfy, but to avoid the sharp pains that signaled starvation drawing closer. When spring finally broke through or rains returned, the shift was almost violent in its sudden relief. New shoots pushed up through thawing ground. Animals grew bold again, and the taste of fresh meat or sweet berries was so profound that it often brought laughter, even tears. But memory is long, and even in moments of abundance, no one forgot the lean seasons. They hoarded what they could. Dried strips of meat hung high away from scavengers, seeds bundled carefully in woven bags. Every scrap a small insurance policy against the next inevitable collapse of plenty. These harsh months carved deep grooves into the collective instinct of humans. They taught patience for bitterness, respect for the smallest living thing that could be coaxed into the stomach, and above all, a hard-edged gratitude that did not rely on pleasure. This was survival stripped to its barest form, where flavor was irrelevant and pride had no place, and where the beauty of the prehistoric diet showed itself exactly for what it was: a raw, relentless fight to keep living when the world offered almost nothing in return. Most of the year, survival rested not on grand, bloody hunts, but on far humbler prizes wrested directly from the earth. This was the true, unadorned backbone of the prehistoric diet: an endless, grinding search for edible plants, roots, and wild greens that might keep the body moving for one more day. If stories of glorious kills fed the spirit, it was these modest gatherings that truly fed the flesh. They foraged tirelessly, eyes trained to catch the faintest irregularity in a patch of grass, a subtle bulge in the soil that betrayed the hidden body of a root. Their hands became their greatest tools, probing, tugging, clawing through dirt for tubers coiled in dark knots underground. Many of these roots weren't the starchy, sweet kinds we might imagine. They were often fibrous, dense, and heavy with flavors that ran sharply bitter or even left a faint burn on the tongue. Leaves were stripped from hardy shrubs, bundled in rough fists, and chewed slowly, not because they pleased the palate, but because they might stave off the dizzy weakness that signaled deeper hunger. Some were tough enough that they had to be crushed first between stones or softened in coals. Others, bright and tender, hid behind thorny defenses that clawed at skin, demanding careful extraction. Their taste, far from the gentle greens of modern salads, ranged from acrid to metallic, sometimes so powerfully herbal it seemed to crawl back up the throat after swallowing. They ate stalks that oozed bitter milks, flowering heads that left mouths dry and slightly numb, and seed pods that crackled between the teeth with little more than ghostly hints of nourishment. The deeper flavors of these wild plants were complicated and often aggressive: sharp alkaloids, sour saps, faint tinges of resin and dust that modern eaters would likely spit out on instinct. But prehistoric tongues, seasoned by necessity, pushed through, learning which aftertastes might signal hidden poisons and which simply meant tough eating ahead. In certain regions, small berries could be found, but these were often far less sweet than the plump varieties coaxed by thousands of years of later cultivation. Many were tart to the point of wincing, leaving lips puckered and throats tight. Yet even these were treasured, eagerly crammed into mouths or carried in woven pouches until they shriveled to chewy, concentrated morsels. Their brief season of abundance was a spark of hope in diets otherwise dominated by rugged greens and hard-to-digest fibers. Seeds offered another fragile lifeline. They gathered them by the thousands, shaking dry stalks into baskets, picking them from low plants with practiced flicks of the wrist. Some were pounded into rough pastes that stuck to teeth and gums, swallowed in gritty lumps that might later twist the gut. Yet in them lay critical fats and scant proteins that made enduring the constant grind of days a touch more possible. What all these plants shared was an elemental harshness. They hadn't evolved for human pleasure. Their flavors were defenses, chemical armors to keep grazing mouths at bay. And so every bite was a negotiation. The people who relied on these foods developed deep local knowledge, understanding which needed to be boiled in several changes of water to leach out irritants, which might be paired with ash or certain clays to bind bitter compounds, which were safest consumed in small, cautious doses stretched over days. This was the ordinary fare of their lives, not the dramatic, visceral kill of a fleeing beast, but hours spent bent low to the earth, hands stained green, mouths working methodically through a catalog of wild tastes that danced constantly on the edge of unpalatable. It was a diet built from countless shades of bitterness and a tolerance for discomfort that ran deeper than mere culinary preference. Here lay the true shape of daily sustenance, a stubborn dialogue between body and land, with the human tongue forced to adapt to a chorus of sharp, strange notes simply because there was no other option. And so through all seasons but the briefest feasts, they chewed and swallowed the rugged language of plants, surviving not through delight, but by steady submission to the rough flavors that nature was willing to offer. Sweetness, the kind that bursts on the tongue and lights up the mind with delight, was a rare visitor in the ancient world. Most of the year, the land offered little that could be called truly sweet, and when it did, it was fleeting, a short window of ripening berries that might vanish under greedy hands or the first cold snap. The idea of strolling through a forest and plucking lush, sugary fruits from every branch is a fantasy born from modern orchards and carefully bred strains. For early humans, berries were often tart, sharply acidic, or downright sour, demanding a tolerance most of us have never needed to develop. They still gathered them eagerly, of course. Even a ghost of sweetness was a gift worth chasing. The smallest bushes scattered across meadows, or the low, tangled plants that clung to rocky soils could bear clusters of tight, hard berries that left mouths puckered and eyes squinting. These were not confections, they were more like botanical challenges, with each mouthful delivering a rush of tart juices that bit back before sliding down. But the scant sugars they contained were precious. They fueled muscles that needed every scrap of energy to keep roaming, climbing, digging, hunting. Children learned early to identify these plants, their quick fingers darting out for anything that looked promising, while adults kept half an eye on the horizon, knowing how fast competition from birds or other foragers could strip a patch bare. Even more central to their daily struggle were the raw tubers buried underfoot, squat, stubborn lumps of nutrition that often looked like little more than swollen roots or woody tumors twisted around stones. Finding them meant reading the whispers of disturbed soil or the way certain stems leaned, clues that something waited below. They dug with pointed sticks or bare hands, prying the earth open to reveal pale, dirty prizes. These tubers were loaded with complex carbohydrates, the slow-burning fuel that might mean the difference between making it through a hungry season or faltering on a long trek. But they carried their own hazards. Unlike the modern potatoes or carrots we've engineered over millennia for tenderness and sweetness, these ancient rootstocks bristled with defenses. Many contained harsh compounds that could inflame mouths and throats, leaving a scratchy burn that lingered long after swallowing. Others harbored mild toxins, enough that a careless meal could bring hours of cramping pain, or, in the wrong dose, something worse. The people who relied on these roots learned which could be safely eaten raw in small quantities, which needed to be sliced thin and left to soak in streams to leach out bitterness, and which were better only after long roasting in the embers of a fire. Even then, mistakes happened. A tuber that looked safe might provoke retching or sweating fevers that left everyone wary of that patch of ground thereafter. Yet they kept digging, because the risk of eating was still better than the certainty of wasting away. The flavors were rarely kind. Many roots brought astringency that tightened the mouth. Others tasted faintly of mold or damp earth. Some left a chalky coating on teeth, a gritty reminder of the minerals packed inside. Still, the bodies of those who foraged adapted, building slow tolerances, and their traditions grew rich with quiet, hard-earned wisdom about which seasons made certain roots milder, or how the first frosts sometimes softened the sharpness, transforming them just enough from borderline to bearable. Together, these raw tubers and sharp berries wove the unglamorous fabric of their everyday sustenance. They did not dine for pleasure, but for the raw calculus of survival. Each harsh mouthful staved off the hollow gnaw of true hunger, bought another day to follow migrating animals, to find a safer valley, to wait for seasons to change. In that long contest with the land, sweetness was a rumor, a brief whisper across the tongue when luck allowed. More often, they lived on flavors that scraped and clawed at the senses, reminders that the earth gave grudgingly, and only to those willing to endure its bitter gifts. When times grew truly desperate, when herds had vanished beyond the horizon, roots and berries were stripped from familiar grounds, and even the most stubborn tubers seemed to have withdrawn deeper into the earth. People turned to the last reluctant offerings of the forest itself. They quite literally ate the woods around them, tearing sustenance from bark and moss in a final determined bid to quiet the hollow ache inside. The inner bark of certain trees, often called cambium, became an unlikely source of life. Not the rough, dead outer shell that flakes beneath the fingers, but the tender, slightly moist layer just beneath, where new growth slowly expanded the tree's girth. They sliced into trunks with sharpened stones, peeling away strips that curled under their grip. Fresh, it could be chewed into fibrous shreds, the sap within releasing a faintly sweet or sometimes bitter resin. It wasn't much, more texture than taste, but it contained trace sugars and starches that, multiplied across enough handfuls, could help push back the threat of weakness. This practice scarred forests with peculiar vertical wounds. Even centuries later, archaeologists find ancient trees bearing silent testimony to those hard seasons, long grooves running up their bodies where desperate hands had stripped them again and again. Some trees, like certain pines or birches, were favored because their cambium was less harsh or slightly richer in stored energy. Though overindulgence could still twist stomachs and provoke diarrhea, a dangerous loss of fluids in a body already teetering on the edge. Mosses and lichens were pressed into reluctant service as well. Found carpeting stones, hanging in drapes from branches, or nestled in the shadowed crooks of trees, these humble organisms rarely offered anything like satisfaction. Their textures ran from soft and spongy to dry and scratchy, their flavors earthy at best, metallic or musty at worst. Some varieties contained compounds that irritated the gut or even acted as mild laxatives. Yet when choices narrowed to nothing, people scraped moss into small bundles, sometimes rinsing it in streams or steeping it in hot water to coax out a weak broth that smelled of damp soil. In certain boreal or tundra regions, they even boiled reindeer moss, a misnamed lichen more closely related to algae and fungi than any true plant, transforming its brittle tangles into a gelatinous mass. The concoction was far from appetizing and could strain the digestive system, producing bloating or cramps. Still, it provided trace carbohydrates and minerals that might carry a starving person a little further along the grim road of survival. Eating the forest came at a cost beyond flavor. Bark and moss packed dense fibers that human intestines struggled to break down. Consumed in any volume, they could swell inside, leading to painful distension or, in extreme cases, dangerous blockages. Stories carried down through generations, some even echoed in indigenous oral traditions, warned of people who filled themselves on these last resort foods, only to grow sick, unable to pass the stubborn bulk until weakness clamored them. Yet such risks were weighed against the more immediate peril of doing nothing. Faced with the creeping torpor of prolonged hunger, a distended belly that paradoxically signaled the body's desperate breakdown of its own tissues, they chose action. They chewed bark until their jaws ached, gathered handfuls of moss with numb fingers, and coaxed the least nourishment from places no animal competitors bothered to look. This was not foraging as hopeful exploration, it was foraging as grim endurance, a direct, almost primal plea to the land itself. Give us something, anything, to keep us moving. And so, in these moments, they dined on the very skeleton and skin of the forest, paying with raw guts and restless nights, all in the stubborn hope that by morning something better might appear on the horizon. Most people today recoil instinctively at the idea of popping a plump larva into their mouths or crunching down on the hard shell of a beetle. But for countless generations before us, this was not a repulsive novelty or survival stunt. It was simply food. In fact, insects and their soft-bodied young were some of the most consistent sources of nourishment available, offering reliable proteins and fats when larger game proved elusive or the ground's offerings grew sparse. Unlike the animals that roamed distant meadows or clustered in wary herds across the plains, insects were everywhere. They buzzed through the air, crawled under rotting logs, wriggled beneath stones and leaf litter. Their presence didn't hinge on great migrations or delicate seasonal balances in quite the same way that herds of deer or caribou did. If you took the time to look closely, to flip rocks, peel back bark, poke carefully into damp, dark crevices, you could almost always find something alive and squirming. Early humans quickly learned to read the subtle signs: the glossy sheen of beetle shells peeking from cracks, the faint tremor of a branch betraying hidden caterpillars, the damp smell that suggested a nest of larvae was near. Hands darted out with practiced speed, seizing small creatures before they could vanish deeper into their hiding spots. Sometimes they ate them raw on the spot, letting instinct override any momentary hesitation. Other times, they carried them back to communal fires, roasting them on flat stones until they popped and curled, releasing a nutty, oily scent that signaled precious fat. Because fat was every bit as critical as protein. Muscles craved it, brains demanded it, and in many lean periods, the soft bodies of grubs or the heavy abdomens of certain beetles delivered more concentrated energy than any handful of roots or berries could. For bodies teetering on the knife edge of malnutrition, even small amounts made a profound difference. Insects also brought unexpected gifts in the form of micronutrients. While plants offered fibers and a scattered assortment of vitamins, many insects packed iron, zinc, and a spectrum of B vitamins, essential to keeping nerves firing and wounds healing. Without these, even a belly seemingly full of rough greens could slowly betray its owner. Skin grew thin, muscles wasted, infections lingered. A clutch of larvae, by contrast, could quietly patch up these subtle deficits, restoring balances invisible to the naked eye but felt keenly in every sluggish movement. There was little room for squeamishness. The people who depended on these tiny creatures could not afford delicate sensibilities or cultural taboos. Children learned alongside adults how to spot clusters of eggs under leaves, or follow the erratic flight of certain insects back to their nests. Small fingers prized open crumbling logs, delighting at the sudden reveal of pale, plump bodies twisting in the gloom. Even older members, whose teeth struggled with tough roots and who had long since lost taste for bitter greens, could savor the soft, yielding richness of larvae, needing little effort to chew. Far from being some exotic desperation food, insects wove themselves into the normal rhythm of life. They were gathered systematically, their appearances anticipated with a kind of practical gratitude. In regions where termites built towering mounds, entire families would raid these structures, scooping up handfuls of the industrious insects and their soft queens. Near rivers, dragonfly larvae were coaxed from muddy banks, adding still more variety. This reliance did more than fill bellies. It forged a direct, almost intimate relationship with the hidden layers of the ecosystem. Every overturned stone, every careful pull at damp bark was an act of profound attentiveness to the small workings of the world. And so protein didn't always thunder across open grasslands on four legs. More often, it squirmed gently in a cupped palm, its promise not diminished by its size, but magnified by the quiet certainty that, at least for today, there would be something to eat. True sweetness was a rare, almost mythical gift in the prehistoric world, something so extraordinary that it could shift the mood of an entire band from quiet endurance to exuberant celebration in a single afternoon. Unlike the steady supply of sugar that floods modern lives, tucked into fruits bred to bursting, poured into coffee from shining bowls, lurking in sauces and bread, for those early people, it was a delight so scarce that even the memory of tasting it lingered for weeks. Honey stood at the pinnacle of these scarce treasures. It was pure, concentrated energy, captured sunlight distilled by the patient work of countless bees, tucked away behind combs in hidden hollows or suspended from branches like small golden miracles. It glowed with a richness that most would only ever taste a handful of times in their entire lives, if at all. Finding it was less a routine of gathering and more a stroke of fortune that could tilt the scales of survival dramatically, if only for a short while. Those who spent their days scanning treetops for movement or listening to the faint, busy hum of a distant hive were hunters of a different kind. The signs were subtle, a droning line of insects weaving purposefully through air, the telltale flicker of bee activity high on a sunlit branch. When a hive was located, it sparked a tense calculation. Approaching meant risk. Stings could be painful, even dangerous, and climbing into the tangled heights of an old tree might end in a fall. Yet the promise waiting inside was too compelling to ignore. When they succeeded, tearing open a hive with careful hands or blunt tools of stone and wood, the prize spilled out in thick, amber folds. Honey dripped over fingers and chins, sticky and fragrant, so overwhelming to mouths accustomed to bitterness and stringy starch that it could provoke open laughter, tears, and wide-eyed, almost childlike wonder. It was not just sweetness on the tongue. It was a sudden infusion of calories so dense and easy to absorb that it seemed to bring the world into sharper focus, strength returning to limbs worn by endless searching. Beyond sugar, honey delivered enzymes, trace minerals, and a burst of hydration that bodies craved. Even the comb itself could be chewed, wax yielding reluctantly to determined jaws. Little surprise that some groups lingered near a discovered hive for days, drawing out the bounty carefully, making the most of each bite. And if they managed to carry slabs of honeycomb back to their camp, the mood there transformed. Stories suggest feasting that bordered on frenzied, children crowding forward with sticky hands, elders closing their eyes to savor each slow mouthful. It was not just sweetness on the tongue, it was a sudden infusion of calories so dense and easy to absorb that it seemed to bring the world into sharper focus, strength returning to limbs worn by endless searching. Beyond sugar, honey delivered enzymes, trace minerals, and a burst of hydration that bodies craved. Even the comb itself could be chewed, wax yielding reluctantly to determined jaws. Little surprise that some groups lingered near a discovered hive for days, drawing out the bounty carefully, making the most of each bite. And if they managed to carry slabs of honeycomb back to their camp, the mood there transformed. Stories suggest feasting that bordered on frenzied, children crowding forward with sticky hands, elders closing their eyes to savor each slow mouthful. But despite its wonder, honey was never a stable foundation for survival. Bees were capricious architects, choosing nesting sites according to needs invisible to human eyes. Seasons or sudden weather shifts could devastate colonies, leaving promising branches cold and silent. Even when found, hives were finite. Once plundered, they required long months or years to recover, if they recovered at all. There was no concept of harvesting sustainably. In those days, it was a simple, immediate decision. Take what the forest gives while it gives it. So honey was a kind of miraculous interruption in the monotony of tough greens, sour berries, and tough fibers. It couldn't be relied on as a winter store. It was too unpredictable, too coveted, and often consumed almost immediately, because bodies screamed for its quick-burning fuel. In that way, each discovery was a momentary reprieve, a dazzling flare of joy and relief against the backdrop of daily scraping by. It might keep a group from despair a little longer, buy them extra vigor to roam further, perhaps parry them to the next valley in hopes that fortune might smile again. Sweetness, in their world, was less a guarantee and more a reminder of how astonishing even a brief abundance could be, a fleeting golden spell that made the endless struggle seem, if only for a moment, almost worth it. The modern mind reels at the thought of sinking teeth into meat that's begun to slip into decay, its edges darkened, its scent heavy with the unmistakable tang of rot. Today, the slightest whiff of sourness sends us rushing to throw food away, convinced it spells certain illness. But for countless generations of early humans, putrid flesh was not simply a last resort. It was a quietly accepted, sometimes even eagerly seized, opportunity to stave off collapse. Hunger does strange things to perception. When days stretched on with little more than bitter greens and stringy roots, the promise of dense animal protein, no matter how it presented itself, became nearly irresistible. Carcasses found by chance, half hidden in grass or snagged against riverbanks, could transform into sudden windfalls. A deer struck down not by human hands, but by accident, disease, or the stealth of predators, might lie a day or two before discovery. By then, its belly could be bloated, flies already busy, the skin warm with bacterial industry beneath the sun. Still, when confronted with the stark arithmetic of survival, the calculus was simple: risk discomfort, even illness, or endure the creeping weakness of bodies starved for fat and iron. Many chose the former, sometimes masking the worst of the odor with smoke, or scraping away outer layers slick with slime. Often they simply ate what was there, driven by instincts deeper than revulsion. The first bites might trigger a flinch, a gagging reflex quickly suppressed by the sharper reflex of survival. Archaeological sites reveal cut marks on bones that suggest humans routinely finished what other predators left behind. They cracked into long bones to scoop out marrow still rich with calories, even if the surrounding flesh had turned dark and slippery. Stone tools bear the polish of sawing through tendons and gristle that was no longer fresh, their edges dulled by gritty, aged tissue rather than the clean, bright snap of newly slain prey. Rotting meat wasn't just about filling stomachs in emergencies. In some ways, it offered hidden advantages. As proteins broke down under bacterial action, they softened, becoming easier to chew and digest. For people with worn teeth or children whose mouths couldn't manage the tough sinews of freshly killed game, this was no small benefit. Even gut flora adapted over time, learning to handle doses of microbes that would send many of us today into spirals of fever and dehydration. There were, of course, lines that couldn't be crossed. Meat far gone into putrefaction could still mean agony or quiet slipping away in the night. But with practice, keen noses and cautious sampling helped judge what level of spoilage was still within the fragile balance of safety. The smell of decay, then, wasn't always a warning. It could be a signal that food, imperfect but still packed with life-sustaining fats and minerals, lay close. Families might cluster around a carcass, children watching wide-eyed as adults carved away blackened sections to reveal morsels that, despite their state, might keep them going for weeks. Fires would be fed higher to roast questionable cuts, smoke mingling with the heavy perfume of rot to form a strangely hopeful aroma that meant bellies might be quiet tonight. This acceptance of decay was woven into the quiet fabric of their days, unremarkable and unjudged. There were no written recipes, no rituals of seasoning or preservation beyond smoke and patience, just an unspoken agreement with the harsh world around them. Take what it gives, even if it's already begun to slip back into the soil. In that way, the stench of rotting flesh became not merely a marker of death and endings, but also a thin, unpleasant promise that tomorrow might still find them standing, breath steaming under a cold dawn, ready to keep searching for the next unlikely chance to survive. When the flesh was long gone, stripped by sharper teeth, by time, by crawling things that cleaned carcasses better than any blade, bones remained. Bleached under the sun or half buried in loam, they might seem to promise little to a starving band of humans passing by. But those hollow shafts and sturdy skulls still held secrets, hidden stores of fat and vital oils locked away from rot and insects, waiting for anyone clever or desperate enough to crack them open. In many ways, bones were nature's hidden larders. The marrow that nested inside long bones was dense with calories, rich in lipids and nutrients that bodies wrung dry by endless wandering desperately needed. Early humans developed a sharp instinct for recognizing which remains were worth the effort. Even after scavengers had worried away the muscle, a pile of gnawed femurs or ribs could spark quiet excitement. Tools were brought out, stones selected for heft and edge, and the work began. Hammering, grinding, tapping at exact angles until the hard walls split and revealed the soft, greasy treasure within. They didn't stop with leg bones. Skulls, heavy and oddly fragile in the right spots, offered another prize. Brain tissue hid behind thick domes of bone, protected from both the ravages of air and opportunistic jaws for much longer than external cuts of meat. Though modest in volume, this tissue was a nutritional powerhouse, packed with fats essential to keeping brains sharp and bodies warm. Scenes replayed across countless prehistoric campsites, a cranium held steady against a flat rock, a well-placed blow shattering it like a crude pottery jar, hands reaching in to scoop out the pale mass that steamed faintly in cold air. Archaeologists piecing together these moments thousands of years later find unmistakable clues. Collections of cracked bones litter ancient hearths, their splinters showing spiral fractures that tell a precise story, not the random breakage of trampling animals or the slow crush of earth, but purposeful strikes designed to pry them open. Cut marks from stone blades score the edges, tiny slices that speak of careful extraction. Skulls bear impact scars right where pressure would force the vault to cave, edges smoothed from countless hands twisting and tugging. Sometimes, entire sites seem almost built around this patient industry. Fire pits filled with splintered tibias and crushed crania, with nearby piles of flakes struck from stones to keep blades sharp for the next round. Ash mixed with bone dust, where fragments were tossed carelessly aside. The scene repeats across continents and ages, from the chilly steppes of Eurasia to the sun-hammered plains of Africa, all carrying the same quiet testament. When other food sources faded, the patient cracking of bones offered one last chance to coax sustenance from bodies already given over to the earth. It was a practice born not from savagery, but from sheer practical intelligence. No calorie was wasted, no overlooked cavity left untapped. In a world that offered so few certainties, the marrow in old bones and the soft yields of brain tissue could mean the fragile difference between families that dwindled under winter's long shadow and those who staggered through it to see another spring. So they learned to read bones as opportunity, to hear the subtle promise carried in their hollow weight, and to strike with practiced hands that understood exactly how to break them open and share whatever small, life-sustaining gifts still waited inside. When at last fortune smiled and a hunt ended not in empty-handed return, but in the heavy thud of a fallen animal, the celebration was immediate. Yet it wasn't thick cuts of muscle they reached for first. In a twist that might surprise modern appetites, the richest prizes were often the parts hidden deep within, the organs pulsing with life just moments before, and above all, the warm, dark rush of blood itself. Blood was precious in ways that went far beyond its taste or texture. For bodies chronically teetering on the edge of anemia, for people whose diets leaned heavily on tough greens and thin roots, iron-rich blood was nothing less than a restoration of color to their skin, of strength to muscles that threatened to falter. As soon as the beast lay still, knives of stone or sharpened bone were slipped along the neck or across the belly, guiding out the bright stream into waiting hands or hollowed vessels. Sometimes they drank it then and there, still hot, the metallic tang blooming across tongues almost like a forbidden delicacy. Other times it was stirred quickly over coals to thicken, forming clots that could be eaten by the handful or mixed into simple broths. But it was not just blood that drew eager eyes. The internal organs, glistening and slick, were removed with careful urgency. They spoiled faster than muscle, their warmth a ripe invitation to bacteria, and so were consumed first, often right there beside the carcass, before even thinking of hauling the rest back to camp. The liver was a treasure above all. Rich in fats and vital vitamins, its deep, almost velvety texture was unlike any other part of the body. A single liver could carry enough nutrients to correct weeks of silent deficits gnawing at nerves and bones.
Kidneys and hearts followed closely in value. They were dense, powerful tissues, saturated with minerals and unmistakably savory. Even lungs found their way into hungry mouths, sliced into strips and quickly roasted or boiled to avoid the rapid slide into rot. The stomach itself, emptied and cleaned as best as hands could manage, could be cooked down or even used as a makeshift vessel to hold chopped bits of other offal and herbs, an early, unceremonious ancestor of the sausage. Intestines, once thoroughly flushed, provided slippery conduits of fat and connective tissue, boiled or seared on rocks until they curled and crisped. Even spleens and small glands weren't dismissed. Everything inside an animal was measured for potential, because every scrap meant another day of children playing instead of wilting into quietness, of adults maintaining the stamina to chase or flee. To modern sensibilities, shaped by abundance and long lines of glossy supermarket cuts, these choices might seem grim, even barbaric. But in a landscape where a full belly was a rare, ephemeral grace, wasting any part of a hard-won kill bordered on madness. They prized organs precisely because they understood, in the marrow of their own bodies, how fragile health was without the dense nutrients packed within. Muscle might look impressive strung along a bone, but it was the hidden machinery inside, the blood, the liver, the layered knots of viscera, that rebuilt bodies worn thin by relentless searching. So the first feast around a fresh kill was often a vivid, intimate affair. Faces lit by fire, hands slick with fluids, laughter, not from delicacy, but from sheer relief. It was a moment of vivid life snatched back from the quiet, looming threat of decline. They honored these organs not through ritual plates or elegant seasoning, but through immediate, grateful consumption, knowing full well that by embracing what pulsed at the very heart of the animal, they gave themselves the best chance to keep their own hearts beating strong through the long, uncertain days ahead. Few subjects cast such a long, uneasy shadow over our ideas of the distant human past as the whisper of people consuming their own kind. It sits at the crossroads of horror and fascination, a taboo so deeply ingrained that even the faintest suggestion of it sends a chill. And yet, buried beneath the layers of myth and exaggeration lies a reality that is both simpler and more haunting. In the cold calculus of survival, the line between ritual and raw desperation was sometimes thin enough to vanish entirely. Stories of cannibalism among early humans often grow wild in the telling, fed by our modern appetite for the grotesque. We imagine savage feasts under a blood-red moon, savage chants rising as flesh is torn apart. These images have more to do with Gothic fantasy than with the quiet, grim necessity that occasionally pressed prehistoric people beyond even their own harsh norms. In truth, the archaeological traces suggest a story neither drenched in constant horror nor free of it. A story written in cut marks on bones and careful breaks designed not to honor the dead, but to open them up. Sites scattered across Europe, Asia, and the Americas have yielded bones that once carried human flesh, now etched with unmistakable signs of butchering. Long bones are split in exactly the same way as those of deer and antelope found at the same campsites, cracked lengthwise to reveal marrow. Skulls show careful breaks at points that would allow hands to reach the rich, fatty brain inside. The same stone blades that sliced haunches of mammoth left parallel marks along human femurs, an uncomfortable testament to how necessity can strip even the deepest cultural barriers to their roots. Not all of these instances were born from the same desperate motive. Some evidence points to practices wrapped in ritual, defleshing, and modification that seem more symbolic, possibly to release spirits or honor ancestors in ways we can only guess at now. Skulls sometimes shaped into cups or painted with ochre suggest a reverence twisted together with practicality. In these moments, eating human flesh might have been less about feeding the belly than feeding the beliefs that held a fragile community together. But alongside these echoes of ceremony lie far starker scenes. Layers of refuse reveal patterns that speak of lean seasons. Animal bones mixed with human ones, all treated with equal pragmatism. Scraps of gnawed human ribs tossed into hearth pits, charred and cracked in ways indistinguishable from those of hunted prey. The line between symbolic consumption and sheer, gut-driven survival blurs most under the weight of starvation, when choices shrink to a pinprick of possible actions, all of them grim. It is here that cannibalism becomes most chilling, not because it was savage, but because it was heartbreakingly human. Imagine a band of people, worn thin by a brutal winter or a drought that has scoured the land clean. Children grow silent, elders sleep more than they wake. And in that crushing stillness, eyes turn not with malice, but with a horrible calculation, toward the bodies of those already lost. The alternative might be the extinguishing of every life around the fire. In that bleak moment, the very bonds of kinship, which usually forbid such acts most fiercely, become twisted under the press of raw survival. These are not comfortable truths. They unravel the tidy narrative of noble ancestors walking hand in hand toward progress. Instead, they reveal people as they truly were, capable of tenderness and loyalty, but also driven by a hunger so profound it could momentarily outweigh even the strongest taboos.
And perhaps most unsettling is the understanding that we are built from their blood, shaped by the same fragile machinery that, under enough strain, might make similar choices. So when we unearth bones bearing parallel striations from flint knives, or skulls shattered just so, we're confronted not with monsters, but with a mirror. It reflects a past where the line between ritual and desperation ran razor thin, where life clawed forward by any means, even at the most terrible cost. In those silent gaps between heartbeats, long before written memory, they did what they believed they had to, and left behind a record we still struggle to look at without flinching. Far from the grand chases across open plains or the glorious toppling of towering beasts, most hunting in the prehistoric world was humble, messy, and exhausting. The romantic vision of mighty hunters hefting spears at mammoths or battling giant elk dominates our stories. But these spectacular kills were rare punctuation marks in a life of far more ordinary, mud-smeared pursuits. Day after day, survival depended on far smaller, less glamorous quarry. Creatures quick to hide, stubborn to catch, and barely enough to quiet a belly even when captured. Hares, rodents, lizards, small birds. These were the real staples of the hunt for much of the year. They were everywhere, which was both blessing and torment. Unlike large herds that vanished over the horizon, small game lingered close to human settlements, darting through brush or nesting in burrows underfoot. But catching them was neither simple nor noble. It meant long hours of crouching in undergrowth, lying motionless in damp grass until muscles burned from stillness, or painstakingly tracking the faint disturbances left by tiny feet. More often, it meant getting on hands and knees, clawing at dirt, widening burrow mouths with sticks or stones, feeling for the sudden shudder of warm life trying to bolt deeper. Sometimes hunters would flood holes with water carried laboriously from streams, hoping to drive panicked animals out into waiting hands. Other times, they smoked them out, feeding small fires at tunnel mouths until choked breath forced the frightened prey to emerge, blinking and coughing. Easy to grab, but still desperate enough to bite. Catching birds was equally tedious. Nets woven from plant fibers or sinew were stretched across game trails or between trees, demanding careful placement and endless patience. Pitfalls and simple deadfall traps offered another method, but they needed constant checking, resetting, and tweaking. A day spent tending traps might yield a handful of scrawny birds or a single unlucky rabbit. Hardly the feast sung of in later legends, but enough to stave off the dangerous fatigue that came from running on empty. Even reptiles entered the pot when chance allowed. Lizards sunning on rocks could be pinned with quick hands or long sticks. Snakes were riskier, but often worth it, their bodies dense with protein and easy to roast whole over coals. None of these catches offered much fat, leaving the mouth feeling oddly dry even after eating, and doing little to replenish reserves needed to face cold nights. Still, they were infinitely better than nothing, so each creature snagged from brush or dragged from a hole was received with quiet gratitude. The work was far from the clean drama of cinematic hunts. It left people caked in soil, smeared with the wet churn of disturbed nests, scratched raw by brambles, or bitten by creatures defending themselves with sharp little teeth. Hands returned to camp bloodied not by valiant battle with giants, but by tiny claws and the grind of stone against nail beds from digging. There was no triumphal march, no awestruck crowd, just the weary relief of knowing there was something, anything, to simmer in the communal pot. This endless toil, gritty and undignified, formed the true backbone of hunting life. It required patience that bordered on torment, an intimacy with mud, roots, and shadows that few today would tolerate. And yet it fed families more reliably than any rare triumph over giants. In this humble, dirty business of chasing rabbits and rodents lay the quiet, persistent heroism that kept the fragile thread of human survival unbroken through countless lean seasons. It was not glorious, but it was profoundly necessary, and it revealed a kind of courage more enduring than any fleeting conquest over mammoth or aurochs.
Near rivers that carved patient paths through the land, or along ragged coastlines where salt met stone, some of the earliest humans found a different strategy to push back the relentless edge of hunger. Fish darted in clear shallows, silver flashes promising fragile hope, while shellfish clung stubbornly to rocks and buried themselves in mud, tiny sealed vaults of protein and brine. For groups lucky enough to settle even temporarily near these waters, the possibility of food seemed to lie just within reach, but it came with its own stubborn trials and cruel illusions. Fishing in the prehistoric world was neither simple nor consistently fruitful. Without nets of modern weave or lines wound from synthetic marvels, they relied on tools painstakingly carved from bone, wood, or stone. Simple spears required hours of silent stalking along banks, or standing knee-deep in cold water, waiting for the ripple of movement that betrayed a fish's glide. A missed thrust meant another long stretch of patient stillness, muscles aching from cold, or the effort to remain perfectly poised. Sometimes they crafted weirs from woven branches, crude fences set across narrow points in streams to funnel fish into shallow traps. These could work brilliantly during spawning runs, briefly turning a calm section of river into a frantic churn of flashing bodies, a living larder to be harvested with grateful hands. But outside these short windows of abundance, the same traps might sit empty for days, wooden bars collecting only drifting leaves. Along rocky shores or tidal flats, people pried mollusks from stones or dug clams and cockles from gritty beds, backs bent for hours under sun or drizzle. Fingers worked raw by rough shells still pressed on, because each opened shell promised a small mouthful of flesh, salty and strangely satisfying. Yet even this was uncertain. Storms could strip coastlines clean or bury rich beds under layers of silt. Cold snaps changed currents, driving schools of fish away and silencing tidal pools that once teemed with crabs and snails. Shellfish themselves carried hidden dangers. They fed indiscriminately, filtering water that sometimes teemed with toxins from blooms invisible to human eyes. A handful of tainted clams could bring violent sickness, racking the body that was already thin from constant underfeeding. In many places, bitter lessons etched into communal memory which seasons were safest, guiding when it was wise to forage the mud and when it was better to walk on by, stomachs grumbling, but bodies spared worse. Even where fish ran thick or beaches glittered with bivalves, this bounty often couldn't be stored for long. Without steady methods of smoking or salting, techniques that developed unevenly across different times and cultures, the catch had to be consumed quickly. Left too long, fish turned soft and sharp-smelling, inviting sickness rather than strength. This meant that sudden windfalls fed the band splendidly for a few days, only to vanish, leaving them once more scouring banks for the next uncertain haul. Still, the draw of water remained powerful. Groups returned to these places season after season,
chasing cycles that were just predictable enough to stake their fragile survival on. Children learned to overturn stones to flush small crabs, or stand barefoot in stream beds, feeling for the slippery dart of fish against ankles. Elders sat nearby, weaving baskets or tools, keeping one eye on the ripples for signs that a shoal might be moving through. In the end, fish and shellfish were threads in the larger, fraying tapestry of their diet, a hope, never a promise. They filled bellies when luck aligned and left them gnawing on roots or chasing insects when tides and currents failed. Even so, the chance to taste the rich oil of a roasted fish or the briny tang of mollusk meat gave fleeting relief from bitterness and bark, a small reminder that the Earth's waters, like its forests and plains, could still surprise them with moments of mercy. At some unknowable moment, under stars that watched in silent witness, a handful of early humans gathered close to flames, not just for light or warmth, but to change forever how they would live and how they would eat. This shift was neither sudden nor uniform. No grand revelation swept through clans all at once. Instead, it likely emerged from countless cautious experiments. A piece of meat dropped by accident into embers and snatched back with burned fingers, then sniffed, nibbled, and finally devoured with a startled, dawning pleasure. Fire had long been a companion for driving away the chill, warding off the prowling shapes in the dark. But once people learned to tame it, to keep embers alive, to carry sparks from one camp to another, they discovered its power to transform the very chemistry of their food. Raw flesh, tough roots, bitter greens, all bent under heat, yielding flavors and textures unknown to any creature that fed only on nature's untouched offerings. Cooking unlocked a treasure hidden within even the most unpromising fare. The fibers of meat softened, marrow melted out more easily. Tubers that once burned the throat mellowed into sweet, starchy masses. Dangerous compounds in certain plants broke down over flame, rendering them safe or at least less punishing to tender stomachs. What once demanded endless chewing, wearing down teeth to painful nubs, now gave way with gratifying ease. The smoke itself was part of the magic. It curled around food, seeping into cuts of meat and clusters of leaves, laying down flavors that danced between sharp and mellow. Even insects, skewered on small twigs, crackled over hot coals, their insides turning rich and toasty instead of bursting cold and raw between the teeth. Bones tossed into the fire for long hours gave up broth thickened with dissolved minerals, something warm to sip that left mouths coated in faint, greasy comfort. Cooking didn't just change the taste or safety of what they ate, it transformed their bodies and futures. Warmed by easily digestible calories, they could extract more nourishment with less internal struggle. Bellies worked less furiously. Energy once diverted to heavy, grinding digestion could be spent on sharper thinking, longer travels, more complex cooperation. Over countless generations, even jaws and teeth subtly reshaped, reflecting a diet that no longer demanded endless tearing and grinding. Fire also remade how they gathered. Foods previously ignored as too fibrous or slightly toxic now found their way into baskets and satchels because flames could tame their worst traits. This expanded menu didn't just mean fuller stomachs, it meant a better buffer against famine. With cooking, entire landscapes became more edible. The forest didn't merely offer occasional fruits or nuts anymore. It offered roots and tough greens that could be coaxed into surrender by the patient heat of coals. And something else profound happened around those early hearths. The flickering light drew people close together, binding them not just in mutual need for warmth or protection, but in shared moments of waiting and eating. Conversations grew, laughter sparked, stories flowed easier when mouths weren't locked around sinewy, raw lumps. The act of cooking, of tending a fire, of handing food to another, of waiting side by side for the right moment to pull a prize from the flames, quietly cemented bonds that might otherwise have frayed under constant stress. This was humanity's first and perhaps greatest culinary revolution. A subtle, smoky miracle repeated night after night under shifting skies. It stitched together families and tribes, extended lifespans, carved new paths for wandering minds and finer hands. From simple firesides grew all future kitchens and feasts, all the spices and stews and delicate dishes yet to come. But at its heart, it remained what it always was, the deep, wordless relief of tasting something warm that didn't fight the body, but fed it gently, filling hollow places with the quiet promise that tomorrow might be just a little easier. Not every venture into the forest or field ended with a triumphant return carrying safe nourishment. For all their hard-won knowledge, all the shared lessons about which plants to trust and which to fear, early humans still walked a razor's edge when it came to what they put into their mouths. The landscape was crowded with deceptive gifts, roots and berries that beckoned with bright colors or fragrant leaves, only to betray them once swallowed. And in a life already perched on the narrow ledge of survival, the penalties for guessing wrong could be swift and devastating. Mistakes happened because they had to. Hunger pushed people into dangerous bargains with the unknown. A berry never before tasted might be the key to easing days of gnawing emptiness. A mushroom nestled invitingly under damp leaves seemed no more sinister than one gathered seasons before, until it twisted inside the belly with cruel efficiency. There were no helpful field guides, no universally agreed-upon rules of thumb. Often, knowledge was local and patchy, passed down by word of mouth or by the quiet caution of elders who steered children's curious hands away from certain patches of ground. But memory was fragile, and the world was vast and varied. What looked safe in one valley could prove a silent killer in another. Even a plant long trusted might shift its chemistry slightly with the whims of soil, rainfall, or the creeping advance of an early frost. Sometimes people simply gambled, driven by an emptiness that made any risk seem reasonable. A small group might taste a handful of unfamiliar tubers or mushrooms, because doing nothing meant the same end, only slower. The consequences were often immediate and brutal. Bellies seized up with cramps that doubled bodies over in the dust. Mouths flooded with saliva as the gut rebelled, trying desperately to purge the intruder. Sweats broke out even in cold air, skin turning clammy, eyes dulling as strength drained away. In some cases, a violent purge was enough to save a life, bodies violently rejecting poison through hours of wrenching sickness, leaving survivors weak but still breathing by dawn. In other, harsher outcomes, paralysis crept upward from the gut, breathing slowed, and the quiet fell for good. These grim episodes left marks not just on families, but on entire communities. The loss of even a few members under such circumstances etched deep cautionary tales into group memory. Children grew up hearing quiet, urgent instructions. Never eat from that bush with the pale veins on its leaves. Never pull roots near the standing stones after a heavy rain. Always test a small bit first and wait before sharing more. In this way, a rough system of trial and error gradually mapped out the safest menu. But it was a system bought at a terrible price, paid in convulsions and shallow breaths, in hurried burials just beyond the circle of campfire light. Ironically, some of these same dangerous plants found careful, controlled uses later on. Tiny doses that once accidentally brought a child to the edge of death might be administered deliberately to dull pain during a ritual or to ease the agony of a wound too far gone. The thin line between medicine and poison was something they understood intimately, born from generations of lessons inked in suffering. So while we often imagine early humans as possessing an infallible, instinctive wisdom about the natural world, the truth was much harder. Knowledge was earned by the slow, grim elimination of errors, by the tears of parents who learned too late that a familiar-looking berry concealed a quiet assassin. And for every night spent in relief around a shared meal of safely cooked greens or roasted meat, there were other nights when the circle shrank by morning, stark reminders that the earth did not always reward hunger with mercy. The bodies of those early humans were fortresses built by relentless necessity, shaped inside and out by the merciless demands of their environment. They didn't simply endure the harsh diet of wild roots, raw insects, and half-spoiled meats. Their insides were living laboratories, teeming with microbial allies that helped turn these dubious meals into usable fuel. Compared to them, our modern digestive systems are pale, pampered descendants, weaker and more fragile in many of the ways that once mattered most. The guts of prehistoric people hosted a riot of bacteria and other microorganisms that we can scarcely imagine now. These microscopic residents weren't just passive hitchhikers, they were active partners, breaking down tough fibers from plants that today would pass largely untouched through our intestines. When early humans chewed bark or fibrous greens that would give many of us cramps or diarrhea, their dense colonies of gut microbes set to work, extracting every possible calorie, fermenting stubborn carbohydrates into short-chain fatty acids that could be absorbed and burned for energy. Their stomachs and intestines were also likely far more acidic and rugged. This wasn't some mystical adaptation, it was the direct result of constant exposure to pathogens in food and water. Their digestive tracts were effectively battlefields where strong acids and aggressive immune defenses worked overtime to keep invaders in check. Consuming raw or aging meat carried dangers, of course, but their systems met those threats daily, building a kind of rugged equilibrium that ours would falter under. A piece of lightly spoiled meat or a handful of unwashed insects might drop a modern eater into bed with fever and stomach pain. But for them, it was just another bite, neutralized by hostile gut chemistry and resilient bacteria accustomed to wrestling with the worst of nature. Their immune systems also bore a temperament forged by this rough life. Constant challenges meant immune cells stayed alert, aggressively tuned to handle parasites, bacteria, and viruses that thrived in untreated water or on the skins of animals freshly killed. They were no strangers to minor infections or parasites. Countless skeletal remains show signs of healed lesions or adaptations to chronic invaders. But these systems balanced constant exposure without spiraling into the autoimmune overreactions so common in our sanitized world. In a sense, their bodies learned by repeated bruising, always dancing with the things that threatened to overwhelm them. By contrast, our own internal ecosystems have grown timid and narrow. Modern diets rich in processed foods, low and diverse plant fibers, and largely sterilized of microbial life have trimmed back the lush forests of gut flora into simpler, more delicate meadows. Our immune systems, underemployed and sometimes confused by this lack of steady training, turn on harmless triggers,
pollen, certain foods, even our own tissues, in a misguided search for something to fight. Meanwhile, our digestive capabilities have slackened. We're less equipped to handle raw, fibrous, or microbe-rich foods without discomfort or outright illness.
This isn't entirely a failing. We traded one set of strengths for another. With agriculture, cooking, and eventually industrial sanitation, we reduced the daily risk of deadly infections and parasites. Our lives grew longer, our children faced better odds, but it also means we are creatures profoundly out of step with the rugged diets and microbial gauntlets our ancestors took for granted. We carry within us a faded echo of the powerful digestive and immune systems that once let humans eat almost anything the wild could offer, an echo that reminds us just how different the world we've built is from the one that first forged us. In the long, grinding calculus of survival, fat was the most precious currency. More than protein, more than the quick rush of simple sugars, it was dense, slow-burning fuel, the kind that could keep muscles working through lean weeks, warm bodies through icy nights, and crucially, feed the ravenous energy demands of the human brain. Without it, early humans didn't just risk weakness in their limbs, they risked dulling the very organ that gave them their edge over claw and fang. This is why the smashing of bones became almost ritualistic in prehistoric camps. Long after the meat was stripped from limbs and the choicest organs had vanished into hungry mouths, people returned to the skeleton itself. Heavy stones were lifted and brought down again and again, sometimes with such force that splinters flew across the packed earth. Each fracture was deliberate, aimed at splitting open the sealed vaults inside, where marrow waited, soft, oily, rich with lipids that could be turned into precious reserves against the cold or sudden scarcity. Marrow wasn't the only treasure. The thick, almost waxy fat stored around kidneys, along the flanks, or packed in hump or tail deposits in certain animals was gathered with almost tender care. In seasons of plenty, they learned to render it slowly over fires, letting it melt into thick pools that could be cooled and hardened. This rendered fat, a primitive version of tallow, was surprisingly stable, resisting spoilage longer than fresh meat. Wrapped in hides or stored inside hollowed bones, it became one of humanity's first true portable energy banks, ready to be scraped and eaten when hunting grew thin. They needed these strategies because the human brain is a greedy organ. It burns through a disproportionate share of calories, most of which must come from glucose, or, in extended shortages, from converted fats. Without enough stored energy, thinking slows, coordination stumbles, instincts lag, all fatal flaws when survival depends on noticing faint tracks in mud or reacting instantly to the crash of an unseen predator through brush. Fat didn't just build bodies, it kept minds sharp, hands steady on spear shafts, feet quick over frost-hardened ground. Groups developed quiet economies around fat. When a large animal fell, decisions were made not only about who would carry what meat back to camp, but who would receive the choicest lumps of suet or marrow bones. These were often shared carefully, given to nursing mothers, growing children, or older hunters whose experience still anchored the group's decisions. Fire pits sometimes bore smears of melted grease where bones had been propped close to flames, coaxing out every drop. In colder regions, fat also became literal insulation. They smeared it on exposed skin to protect against biting winds, mixed it with crushed plant fibers to craft rudimentary salves that sealed tiny cracks and cuts. Nothing was wasted, because every mouthful of fat translated into extra days with enough heat in the belly to endure another frost,
enough clarity in thought to track prey or recognize the scent of water on a dry wind. So marrow and stored fat formed a silent backbone to early human survival. They were not luxuries or indulgences, but critical insurance. Compact, portable energy that could bridge the cruel gaps between hunts or forageable plants. The sight of a cracked femur or a skull carefully split along fault lines is more than a grisly curiosity unearthed by archaeologists. It's a testament to ingenious survival. It speaks of people who understood, instinctively and through long, bitter lessons, that in a world without guarantees, fat was far more than flavor. It was the line between cunning and confusion, between moving on to the next valley or leaving only footprints that winter winds would soon erase. The image that often fills our heads of towering, muscle-knotted hunters striding powerfully through the wilderness, eyes sharp, bodies brimming with robust health, is more fantasy than faithful portrait. The real people who scraped existence from such unforgiving landscapes bore the relentless toll of that life in every visible line and hidden crevice of their bodies. If we could stand among them, we might be struck less by heroic physiques and more by a pervasive, weary fragility. Teeth tell the story first because they preserve the ravages of ancient diets like tiny stone diaries. Many prehistoric skulls reveal mouths riddled with wear, molars ground nearly flat from chewing coarse roots, raw fibers, and gritty particles that clung to plants pulled straight from soil. Small cracks spidered across enamel, opening pathways for decay. Before long, infections could settle deep into jaws, hollowing bone, raising painful abscesses. By their early 30s, an age many never reached, it wasn't uncommon for adults to have already lost several teeth, forced to gum tough fare or favor one side of the mouth. Joints carried another testament. Endless miles on foot, squatting by fires, dragging carcasses across uneven ground, all etched their costs into hips, knees, and lower backs. Fossilized skeletons often show arthritic growths, tiny spikes of bone trying to reinforce failing cartilage, crowding joints and grinding painfully together. Some spines were curved unnaturally from years of hauling or habitual postures, vertebrae pinched where cushioning discs had long since thinned. Malnutrition also left subtle but unmistakable stamps. Bones sometimes paused their growth under the strain of lean years, leaving rings much like trees enduring droughts. These arrested lines hint at repeated seasons where bodies couldn't find enough to fuel both daily survival and proper development. Ribs and long bones might appear slightly bowed or unusually light, suggesting the slow theft of minerals from within as the body cannibalized itself to keep organs alive. And yet it wasn't all stark decline. These people were often lean by necessity, carrying little excess fat. Their muscles, though not monstrous slabs, were conditioned by daily exertion, a tough, wiry strength born from constant motion rather than sculpted in deliberate exercise. But this didn't mean they were paragons of unshakable health. The broad shoulders and powerful grips found in many skeletons existed alongside clear evidence of chronic strain, small tears in muscle attachment points, healed fractures that never quite set straight, limbs subtly mismatched from compensating for old injuries.
Illness, too, wove through their lives with a quiet regularity. Periodic infections flared up, sometimes leaving telltale lesions on bones where the immune system waged drawn-out battles. Parasites sapped nutrients invisibly, stealing iron and weakening the gut, contributing to the pallor and fatigue that no robust muscles could fully mask. So the so-called noble savage, radiant with perfect vitality, was largely a myth born of later Romanticism. In truth,
early humans were battered, resourceful survivors, bodies marked by scars, teeth worn and blackened, joints thickened with strain. They laughed and loved and fought, certainly, but they also limped, winced, and sometimes pressed hands to swollen faces in mute pain. Their appearance was a living record of every drought endured, every hard winter that forced them to chew bark or scavenge old bones. In them, strength was not absence of hardship, but the stubborn endurance of it. It was a kind of rugged grace that carried them forward day after day, even as their bodies recorded, in minute, painful detail, the immense price of staying alive in a world that offered little softness. The truth is not less noble for being harsher. It simply reminds us that survival is rarely beautiful up close, and that each line etched by hardship was proof of a victory, however temporary, over forces that meant to erase them altogether. Imagine dropping a modern person, soft-palmed, accustomed to warm beds and neatly packaged groceries, straight into the shadowed forests or windswept plains where our distant ancestors once prowled. Strip away the convenience of refrigeration, the luxury of clean water at the twist of a tap, the bright comfort of supermarkets lined with endless choice. Give them only a stone tool, their hands, and a belly that will soon begin to complain. Ask them to eat as early humans did, day after unrelenting day. The outcome would be more than humbling. It would be a collision of biology, psychology, and harsh necessity that most would find impossible to endure. Physiologically, the first hurdles would come fast and sharp. Modern digestive systems, coddled by cooked, sanitized, and heavily processed fare, would struggle mightily to handle the coarse fibers, raw microbes, and sporadic doses of borderline spoiled protein that formed the backbone of prehistoric diets. Mouths unaccustomed to grinding tough tubers or chewing gritty greens would blister and bleed. Teeth would wear down rapidly, cracked by unyielding seeds or the sand and dirt clinging inevitably to roots pulled from earth with no rinse more thorough than a quick shake. Even if those first bites were swallowed without obvious harm, our internal flora, long adapted to diets stripped of the diverse bacterial challenges faced by ancient people, would rebel. Gut cramps, diarrhea, bloating from unfamiliar fibers, and wild bacterial blooms could quickly sap strength, leading to dehydration and compounding hunger with exhaustion. The carefully balanced immune systems of modern bodies, fine-tuned to cleaner lives, might overreact to harmless elements while failing to muster effective defenses against pathogens that Stone Age guts took in stride. Psychologically, the ordeal would be just as profound. Today, revulsion keeps us from considering insects, carrion, or the half-bitter, half-toxic plants that often made up prehistoric meals. Early humans didn't have that luxury. Necessity drove them past squeamishness. But modern people, whose lives rarely demand such choices, would face a crushing barrier of instinct. The slick pop of a grub between the teeth, the sour reek of meat just beginning to turn, the acrid bite of a wild root that burns all the way down, these sensations would not merely displease, they could provoke nausea so intense it prevented any real nourishment. Beyond taste and texture, there's the mental chasm of constant uncertainty. Most of us live with profound security about what we eat. We trust that what we bite into will not harm us. Take that away, and every mouthful becomes a gamble, shadowed by the fear of poisoning or infection. The stress alone could erode sleep, cloud judgment, and breed a creeping panic that undermines the careful patience needed to forage or hunt effectively. Medical consequences would not be far behind.
Malnourishment might set in rapidly, as modern metabolisms, accustomed to reliable, calorie-dense foods, failed to extract enough from bitter leaves and stringy scraps. Without adequate fat intake, bodies would begin to break themselves down, muscle feeding the brain's relentless glucose demands, leading to weakness and clouded thought. Persistent diarrhea or parasites from untreated water and raw foods would speed this decline. Wounds would heal slowly, infections might rage unchecked, and without centuries of inherited immunities to certain parasites and bacteria, modern bodies could succumb to things our ancestors weathered almost as routine background discomfort. So, could we truly eat as they did? Not for long. Most would falter at the psychological barriers before the body even began to betray them. Those stubborn enough to push past would still face the limits of digestive systems and immune defenses no longer built to withstand such a raw, untamed menu. Even then, the loneliness of such a life, the relentless grind for every scrap, the constant silent calculation of risk versus starvation, would likely break the spirit long before it claimed the flesh.
What allowed early humans to survive this way was not only tougher guts and sharper instincts honed by a lifetime of exposure, but also communities bound by the shared struggle. They passed down subtle wisdom on which roots needed soaking, which mushrooms were safe only in certain seasons, and where insect swarms reliably clustered. Without that web of inherited knowledge and collective resilience, most of us would be left standing alone in a vast, indifferent wilderness, clutching a rough stone, stomach twisting in confusion, mind racing with doubts, painfully aware of how far removed we are from the lives that once shaped our very bones. Looking back across the gulf of time at what our prehistoric ancestors endured, it's tempting to slip into a kind of odd romanticism. We marvel at their resilience, their apparent closeness to nature, their ability to carve a living from wild landscapes that would send most of us today reeling in daze. Entire modern movements try to recapture what they imagined was a purer, more natural way to eat, building diets that worship meat, raw greens, or even long stretches of near starvation, hoping to unlock some hidden wellspring of vitality. But in truth, the lesson left to us by those distant kin isn't found in what they ate. It's in how astonishingly well they adapted to survive with so little, and how brilliantly they navigated a world that offered them almost no certainty. Their genius wasn't culinary. It was practical, inventive, unrelentingly flexible. They could look at a stretch of ground most of us would write off as barren and find tubers twisted under the soil, spot the telltale rustle that betrayed insects clustered under bark, smell the faint shift in wind that promised migrating game. They devised ways to smash open bones for marrow, leach poisons from roots with repeated washes, test questionable berries in tiny doses before feeding them to a hungry child. Their diet wasn't a matter of choice or philosophy. It was a desperate, day-by-day negotiation with what the land grudgingly allowed, and what their own clever hands and sharp memories could coax from it.
In many ways, their greatest skill was not hunting mammoths or crafting stone blades. It was reading the land and adjusting quickly, letting go of one failing strategy to embrace another, however unpleasant. When large game slipped away, they didn't starve with pride. They dug for grubs and scraped at tree bark. When droughts killed off familiar plants, they moved, seeking new valleys, new river bends, new chances. Their smarts and stubbornness, not their particular meals, were what allowed the fragile thread of humanity to stretch forward across countless lean years into the present day. And if we could somehow call them here, sit them at a modern table, would they long for those old bitter greens and raw insect feasts?
Almost certainly not. Given the choice, many might seize on our fragrant breads, our tender meats, our clean, sweet fruits with unguarded delight. Because they did not suffer those harsh diets out of noble preference, they bore them out of necessity, guided by an unspoken rule: eat what you must to stay alive, however it tastes, however it churns in the gut. So perhaps the real inheritance they left us isn't a menu to copy, but a model of humble brilliance. They remind us that survival, whether in forests choked with snow or modern jungles of steel and neon, hinges on adapting, experimenting, learning quickly from mistakes, and passing those hard-won lessons on. It is this legacy of resourcefulness, not the memory of eating moss or marrow, that still lives most vibrantly in us. And if we honor them truly, it won't be by trying to fill our plates with their desperate fare. It will be by recognizing how astonishing it is that they kept going at all, how they bent and did not break, how they chose again and again to keep moving forward through landscapes that offered no guarantees. In that choice, raw, instinctive, sometimes painful, lies the deepest, most enduring triumph of our shared human story.